In the heart of the Sahel, where the sun scorches the horizon and the wind hums through the bones of forgotten empires, something holy happened. Not in a palace, not in a foreign council hall, but on the burning sands of Tindawan, where silence itself was forced to listen. On that morning, the 11th of October 2025, Africa didn't whisper. She roared. 3 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rose as one body, one mind, one heartbeat. No longer waiting for permission, no longer bowing to the old order. It was the first strike of the Alliance of Sahel States, a moment carved in fire and faith. And at the center of that awakening stood a man, the Burkina Faso President, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, unyielding, unapologetically African. He wasn't seeking applause. He was reclaiming destiny. If you believe Africa deserves to tell its own story, subscribe, stay with us, and let your spirit witness what happened when Africa finally spoke. Before the desert thundered with fire, before the dawn carried the echo of unity, there was an idea, fragile, uncertain, but alive. It began not in the sands, but in the hearts of men who had seen too much blood, too much betrayal. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, 3 nations beaten but unbroken, gathered in the ashes of old promises. In September 2023, they signed the Liptako Gourma Charter. To many outsiders, it was just another document. But to those who lived beneath the Sahel sun, it was a covenant. A declaration whispered in dust. We will defend ourselves. For years, their lands had become battlegrounds for foreign powers, their skies guarded by others, their people collateral in someone else's strategy. But history has a way of circling back, doesn't it? Even the wind remembers the songs of freedom. By July 2024, that whisper became a roar. A confederation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, was born. Not a union of words, but of will. Not just soldiers, but believers. And at the heart of this confederation stood a name that the world would learn to speak with either reverence or fear: Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkina Faso President. Young in age, but old in conviction. While many leaders chased signatures and summits, Traoré chased something holier: sovereignty. He spoke not of handshakes with the powerful, but of hands that build. Not of aid, but of ownership. He said, "The soil beneath our feet is the only flag we need." And the people listened. From Ouagadougou to Timbuktu, from Niamey to Nouna, whispers grew into chants. Farmers, soldiers, teachers, all began to believe that maybe, just maybe, Africa could finally be its own defender. But belief without battle is just a dream. And Traoré knew that dreams are only remembered when they bleed into action. So, in mid-2025, he called for a meeting, not in Paris, not in Geneva, but in Ouagadougou, under the harsh Sahel sky. He summoned his brothers, Assimi Goïta of Mali, Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger. No entourages, no translators, no foreign observers, just 3 men, 3 nations, 1 table. The air in that room was thick, not with politics, but with purpose. Maps were unrolled. Markers drew lines across deserts that had long divided tribes, nations, destinies. And in those lines, something ancient stirred: unity. That day they didn't speak of defense budgets or diplomatic decorum. They spoke of the soil, of the children taken by war, of the markets burned, and the mothers who no longer cried because tears had run dry. Goïta, the strategist, spoke of coordination. Tiani, the sentinel, spoke of fortification. But it was Traoré who spoke of faith. He said, "We are not waiting for the world to approve of our courage." And the room fell silent because everyone knew the time for speeches was over. What followed was blueprint turned into command. A plan so simple, yet so daring. Strike first, strike together, strike home. The operation was named Tindawan, a word that would soon echo beyond the dunes. Now, if you looked at the maps that night, you'd see lines of dust roads crisscrossing barren terrain between eastern Mali and southwest Niger. To most, it was empty desert. To the AES command, it was a nest, a breeding ground for terror, a place where ISIS GS and JNIM cells gathered like vultures around a wounded land. For 6 long months, they had watched the coordinates, tracing heat signatures, catching whispers on broken radio signals. Until one night, the drones captured what no foreign eye had seen before, a congregation of firepower, fuel drums, motorbikes, ammunition caches. The enemy was no longer invisible. And so Tindawan became more than a location. It became a promise that Africa would no longer let its wounds fester unseen. As the commanders prepared, Traore visited the troops. He didn't speak of glory or vengeance. He spoke of legacy. He told them, "The world will not believe in us until we believe in ourselves." The soldiers, many young enough to call him brother, stood straighter. Some cried, some clenched their fists, and somewhere in that stillness, destiny took its breath. That night, as stars burned over the Sahel, the AES banners fluttered like prayers in the wind. 3 nations, once broken, now bound by purpose, waited for dawn. And the desert, for the first time in a long time, was no longer silent. Because when the sun rose over Tindawan, the wind carried not fear, but fire. At 05:18 a.m., October 11th, 2025, the desert exhaled a sound it had not made in generations, the sound of freedom taking aim. A streak of light tore through the dawn sky, silent until the final heartbeat. Then, impact. The ground of Tindawan erupted in sand and smoke. For the first time, the unified forces of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, were not waiting, not retreating, not pleading. They were hunting. From the west came the Burkina Faso hammerhead, ground units hardened by years of desert warfare. Engines cooled overnight to avoid detection, men wrapped in sand-dusted veils. They moved like shadows over the dunes, precise, patient, relentless. From above, the Malian aerial command circled like eagles in prayer, feeding live coordinates to every advancing column. And from the north, Nigerian blocking units sealed the escape corridors, a wall of vigilance, iron and dust. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Each nation, a note in a single hymn. Each soldier, a verse in a chapter that Africa had long been waiting to write. Within 20 minutes, the first target fell. A cluster of motorbikes, fueled and ready for raid, went up in flames. Another strike hit a camouflaged warehouse, half buried in the sand, where ammunition and supplies had been stored under palm canopies. The drones hovered, steady and watchful, as if bearing witness to something sacred. And in the command room of Ouagadougou, the Burkina Faso President, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, watched the feeds in silence. No boasting, no triumph. Only a quiet nod, as if he already knew this victory belonged not to him, but to the soil itself. Out there, the desert was alive, gunfire echoing like thunder against the dunes, soldiers shouting coordinates over encrypted radios, the rising sun painting everything in gold and smoke. For those who fought that morning, it wasn't just a battle. It was baptism. They weren't reclaiming territory. They were reclaiming dignity. One Burkina Faso officer, interviewed days later, said, "It felt as if the desert was fighting with us." Maybe it was. Maybe the ancestors were. By 07:30 a.m., resistance crumbled. 11 insurgents lay dead, caches destroyed, documents and devices seized, and still, not a single civilian fatality reported. That mattered, because the world was watching, waiting for one mistake, one misfire, one tragedy to discredit the entire dream. But AES didn't falter. Every strike had been measured 3 times, every trigger pulled with restraint and reverence. It wasn't victory through vengeance, it was victory through discipline. When the dust finally settled, the commanders ordered the sweep and confirm. Teams moved through the wreckage, marking coordinates, collecting evidence, maps, hand-drawn plans, satellite phones. In one tattered notebook, they found a chilling schedule, a planned series of cross-border attacks into central Mali, dated for the following week. The enemy had been ready, but AES had been earlier. Back in the field, a soldier knelt in the sand and placed his rifle down. He whispered, "For my father, for my land." And for a moment, the desert, still trembling from the echoes of battle, seemed to bow its head in silence. In the cities, news traveled fast. Burkina Faso news lit up with headlines, "AES strikes back, joint operation ends major insurgent hub. 0 civilian casualties, Africa takes the lead." There was no celebration in the streets, only pride in the eyes of the people. Mothers stood taller. Fathers spoke softer, because for once their nation was not portrayed as the victim of another crisis, but the author of its own redemption. And beyond borders, the silence began to spread, not from fear, but from respect. Paris said nothing. Washington offered no comment. Brussels drafted no condemnation. In that silence, Africa heard validation. Because when the world that once doubted you falls quiet, it means it has finally begun to listen. That morning, as the AES troops raised their flags over the dunes of Tindawan, it wasn't about conquest. It was communion. The desert, the soldiers, the ancestors, all breathing as one. And in the voice of that still wind, if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear the words, "This is what freedom sounds like." But the war wasn't over. The louder the victory, the deeper the silence that followed. A silence the West could not explain. When the guns fell silent over Tindawan, the echoes traveled far, beyond the dunes, across the cities, into the corridors of power, where silence means more than speech. For 3 days, there were no press conferences in Paris, no carefully worded statements from Washington, no concerns from Brussels. Just quiet. Cold, deliberate quiet. And that, my friend, was louder than any protest. For decades, Africa had been told what peace should look like, who should deliver it, and how it should be paid for. But now, 3 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, had done what few thought possible. They secured their own soil without foreign boots, without borrowed permission. The Burkina Faso President, Ibrahim Traoré, didn't smile for cameras. He didn't hold a parade. Instead, he visited a school that morning, one that had been closed for years because of insurgent threats. He sat with children, not generals. He said, "Today, your classroom is your victory." Those words spread faster than any headline. In Ghana, leaders quietly admitted that the AES alliance had proven a new model. In Togo, whispers grew louder, of partnerships, of potential, of pride. Even in Ethiopia and Kenya, political analysts called Tindawan the most significant African-led operation of the decade. But perhaps the most profound reaction didn't come from governments or think tanks. It came from the people. In markets across the Sahel, women who once hid from crossfire began to walk with their heads high. In mosques and churches, prayers of gratitude echoed. "Thank you, Lord, for giving us the courage to stand." In the villages near the front lines, men returned to their homes, no longer fugitives in their own land. And across Africa, something intangible shifted. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a moral realignment. For the first time in a long time, Africans weren't waiting for aid to define their success. They defined it themselves. And the West, accustomed to being the architect of every African narrative, found itself speechless. But silence has layers. The silence from Paris was not ignorance, it was recognition. The silence from Washington was not neglect, it was calculation. They knew To criticize AES would be to stand against a new Africa, one that no longer begged, but built. So the world watched, and Africa watched itself. That's when Burkina Faso news began to change tone. The headlines no longer read like tragedies. They read like testaments. Africa acts, West listens. ACE model inspires Pan-African hope. It was subtle, but sacred, because words shape identity, and identity shapes destiny. Meanwhile, international analysts began calling ACE a possible African NATO. One Western journal, hesitant, cautious, wrote, "Perhaps Africa is discovering that unity, not dependency, is the highest form of security." Those words, printed in ink, written by foreign hands, felt almost like an apology. For the West had built a story where Africa could only react, never act. Tindawan rewrote that story. And yet, amid the pride, Traoré reminded his people that victory is a responsibility. He said in a national address, "If we have proven we can fight together, we must now learn to build together." That line echoed in pulpits, in classrooms, in street conversations, because unity, once awakened, must be fed, or it fades back into history. The old powers still waited, watching, analyzing, hoping this alliance would fracture like the others. But the bond between the AES nations wasn't born of convenience. It was born of shared pain. When a people have bled together, their silence becomes sacred. That's what made the aftermath of Tindawan so powerful. There were no fireworks, no slogans, no triumphant boasts, just steady rebuilding, soldiers repairing wells, students returning to lessons, farmers reclaiming fields once ruled by fear. It was quiet work, the kind that never makes international headlines, but changes the course of generations. And for those who doubted, who still believed Africa needed a guardian, the message was simple. We are not children. We are nations. That's why, for many, the silence from the West wasn't an insult. It was a bow, because even silence, when earned through dignity, becomes applause. But history doesn't rest. The world may have gone quiet, but new eyes were turning toward the Sahel, from Harlem to Addis, from Atlanta to Accra, wondering if this was just victory or prophecy. Across the ocean, in the streets of Harlem, in the quiet pews of Atlanta, in the community halls of Chicago's South Side, something stirred when the news of Tindawan broke. No breaking. Headline on CNN. No segment on the evening news. Just whispers and pride. Because for those who still carry the memory of chains, who grew up hearing that Africa was chaos, corruption, and need, what happened in that desert felt like redemption. In barbershops, elders leaned forward and said, "You see? They're doing it. They're standing on their own." In churches, preachers slipped the moment into their sermons. If Africa can rise without permission, then so can we, right here in America. It wasn't just military victory they saw, it was spiritual restoration. For too long, Africa had been the wounded mother, the forgotten homeland, the continent spoken about, never for. But now, her sons were defending her with their own hands, and that truth resonated across generations. The Burkina Faso President, Ibrahim Traoré, became more than a name. He became a symbol. A reminder that leadership can be young and righteous, fierce and faithful at the same time. He stood like the living answer to every doubt ever thrown at Africa's potential. It echoed the spirit of Malcolm X, who once said, "You can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree." It echoed Marcus Garvey's call for African self-reliance. It echoed the dream of Martin Luther King Jr., who believed freedom anywhere strengthens justice everywhere. And so, from Harlem to Ouagadougou, from the Bronx to Bamako, the message was the same. We are one struggle, one lineage, one unfinished story. In academic halls, Black scholars began citing AES as a model for self-determination. In Pan-African forums, speakers invoked Tindawan as proof that Africa was no longer just awakening. She was walking. Even the younger generation, those who never saw the civil rights marches, felt something move inside them. Because now, when they looked at Africa, they didn't just see famine and aid. They saw fire and agency. They saw what happens when pride replaces pity. And maybe that's why so many in the diaspora began to reconnect, spiritually, emotionally, politically, to the motherland. Because this wasn't just Burkina Faso's victory. It was Africa's reminder to her children across the seas. I am still here. I am still rising. But every resurrection demands continuation. And the question still burns. After Tindawan, what comes next for Africa's sons and daughters? Tindawan may be written in history books as a battle. But for Africa, it was never just a battle. It was a beginning. Because the real war is not fought with guns and drones. It's fought in classrooms, in courts, in the hearts of a generation that refuses to be told who they are. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, now stands at a crossroads. Their enemies are not only insurgents hiding in the dunes, but the quieter enemies of progress, division, corruption, despair. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkina Faso President, knows this truth better than most. He once said, "We cannot win the land if we lose the soul." And that is why his mission is shifting, from defense to development, from survival to sovereignty. Roads are being rebuilt, schools reopened, new alliances formed not around dependence, but dignity. Even the way Burkina Faso news tells its stories has changed. No longer repeating foreign narratives, but shaping its own. Each headline now beats like a drum of renewal. Burkina builds for itself. Africa defines its destiny. Because the struggle for independence didn't end in the 1960s, it's alive in every field reclaimed, every child educated, every leader who dares to stand alone under the sun and still call it grace. Across the Sahel, young soldiers now train together under a single banner. Their drills echo through the desert like hymns, not of war, but of vigilance. They are the sons of a continent reborn. And behind them, the spirits of ancestors whisper, "We have waited for this day." Yet the journey ahead will not be easy. The world is watching, some with admiration, some with envy, some with fear, because a united Africa challenges the balance of the old order. But the voice that rose in Tindawan cannot be silenced again. It was too raw, too righteous, too real. The sound of a continent saying, "We are not the story told about us. We are the storytellers now." And as the Sahel winds carry that promise across the dunes, the call reaches far beyond Africa's borders. To every descendant scattered by history's storms. To every believer in dignity and self-determination. To you, listening now. Africa's resurrection has begun, and every believer, near or far, is part of its heartbeat. But a resurrection is not a conclusion, it's a calling. And the question now is not whether Africa can rise, but whether the world is ready when she does. Tindawan was never about conquest. It was about consciousness. It was the moment Africa looked in the mirror and saw not her scars, but her strength. For generations, others wrote our stories. Others defined our heroes, our enemies, our beginnings, our ends. But on that October morning, as the sun rose over the Sahel, Africa wrote her own gospel. And in that gospel, the Burkina Faso President, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stands not as a ruler, but as a reminder. A reminder that leadership is not measured by applause, but by accountability. That freedom is not granted, it's guarded. Every headline from Burkina Faso News now carries that heartbeat. You can feel it between the lines, the rhythm of renewal, the pulse of possibility. And as those stories travel from Ouagadougou to Washington, from Bamako to Baltimore, the message grows clearer. Africa doesn't wait for permission anymore. For too long, we have been taught to see Africa through pity, not pride. But that time is past. Because when one nation stands up, it lifts the continent. When one leader defies the old order, he lights a torch for every soul still walking in shadow. So, to every elder who remembers the struggle, to every young dreamer searching for purpose, to every believer in dignity, this is your moment too. History is not finished. It's still being written right now in the red dust of the Sahel, in the classrooms of Burkina Faso, in the courage of those who refuse to bow. If you believe Africa's voice deserves to be heard, don't just watch. Speak. Leave your thoughts below. Share this story. Let your words join the wind that carried the spirit of Tindawan. Because the world may forget headlines, but it never forgets a resurrection.